Daniel Goldmark is professor of music and director of the Center for Popular Music Studies at Case Western Reserve University right here in Cleveland. He is the author and/or editor of several books, including the cartoon music book, Beyond the Soundtrack, Representing Music in Cinema, Tunes for Tunes, Music and the Hollywood Cartoon, and Jazz Not Jazz, The Music and Its Boundaries. Daniel's current research is on Tin Pan Alley, music publishing, and early film music. Daniel received his BA in music from the University of California, Riverside, and his MA and PhD in musicology from the University of California, Los Angeles. Daniel also spent several years working in the animation and music industries, including some time serving as an archivist and music coordinator at the Spumco Animation in Hollywood. For 5 years, Daniel was research editor at Rhino Entertainment in Los Angeles, where he also produced or co-produced several collections and anthologies, including a 2-disc anthology entitled Courage, the Complete Atlantic Recordings of Rufus Harley, featuring the world's most famous jazz bagpiper. Please join me in welcoming to the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, Daniel Goldmark.
Thank you. All right, we on? Yes, good, okay. Hi, thanks for coming. It's great to be here. I'd say it's so great to be in Cleveland, but I live here. So thanks to Andy and Jenny Thomas and Sully Holder and Jason Hanley and John and Leah and Karen, everybody here from the Rock Hall, Bob Judd at the American Musicological Society, the Communications Committee who helped set this up, and all of you for coming out. It is really beautiful out, so I appreciate you coming here instead. I'm honored to be speaking on this series, and it would be good if I put up my slides. There we go. Ta-da, okay, good. In a talk in this very series 5 years ago, Andy Flory talked about the insight he gained into the ways and means of the reissuing process based on his work as a consultant for the reissue of Marvin Gaye's soundtrack for Trouble Man. Anybody at that? I think some people in the back, yes, you were there. I want to the very notion of reissues, particularly large collections or box sets, which had become such an emblem of the record industry in the 1990s, just before iTunes so profoundly changed the way people acquired and listened to music. My work is based in large part on the 5 years I worked at Rhino Records in West LA, while I was simultaneously working on my PhD at UCLA. That was the building they used to be at. I joined Rhino in early 1997 as a freelance fact checker. There I am. The founders, incidentally, I'm going to be referring to them a lot, are sitting right there. That's Richard Foos and that's Harold Bronson. I began working in-house later in 97 and was full-time by 98. During my time at Rhino, I worked on more than 200 projects. My main job was fact-checking liner notes, but I also ended up writing liner notes for several sets and compiling several other sets, what at other companies would be called producing. And while I'm largely focusing on Rhino's output, I will refer to other labels occasionally because what I'm going to be talking about really applies to the box set, the idea of the box set in general, but there's a lot of specifics to Rhino as well. And we can't forget that what I'm saying applies to pretty much all genres of recorded music, although classical music has its own issues with box sets that I'm not going to really get into. So let's begin with the Rhino story. In brief, Richard Foos opened the Rhino Records store in Westwood, California in 1973. Harold Bronson, the Rhino label co-founder and friend of Foos, began as an employee and eventually became store manager. That's Harold standing out in the front right there. The store became known as a place where collectors were welcomed and a sense of fun and humor was strongly encouraged. Yes, that is Harold standing with two Ramones. From employees dressing up in the store to the various theme days they'd run in the store to the calendar that they created based on the feature calendar handed out at a local art house cinema that would list the various silly promotions they do each day, to the general sense of irreverence and not feeling like they had to take themselves too seriously. The label itself began with the help of a customer, local songwriter and performer Larry Wildman Fisher, who had been discovered by Frank Zappa walking down Sunset Boulevard belting out his own songs. Store manager Bronson recorded Fisher singing Go to Rhino Records on a cassette player in the back room in April of '75 and had the recording originally pressed onto several 145s, which were given away as a promo at the Rhino store.
Go to Rhino Records on Westwood Boulevard. Go to Rhino Records on Westwood Boulevard. They have nice people there. They'll show you where the records are. Where are the records? They're over there. They're all over the place.
You get the idea. Somehow, the song got to DJ John Peel in the UK and made his Festive 50 list of top releases in 1976. it was 48th. And so the label was launched inauspiciously with a record that had an international following, kind of. 2 years later, Rhino's first full album was a collection of Fisher's songs, Wild Mania, or Wild Mania. Now from this point, the label began putting out reissues of indie rock groups, novelty collections, local bands, along with unusual releases like picture discs, that's actually a picture disc right there, colored vinyl, and other fun stuff. I particularly like those two. That's Gefilte Joe and the Fish. Bronson said that, quote, "Our desire we had in forming our company was to reissue the out-of-print records we had loved growing up. The majors were letting a great deal of these recordings languish in their vaults as they focused on big-selling titles by contemporary acts. Mostly, we took pleasure at the absurdity of our intention," unquote. Incidentally, Harold wrote an autobiography not long ago. This is the copy in the library here. If anyone's interested, you can come check it out later. Examples of what he's talking about might include their compilation pairing up various novelty singles, like a wrestling cage match titled Rhino Royale, a very best of the recordings of Alan Sherman, a hand-picked collection of the world's worst records, complete with Barf Bag, or their recording of the Temple City Kazoo Orchestra. This is them appearing on the Mike Douglas show. That's Harold, and that's Richard.
The Temple City Kazoo Orchestra.
You get the idea. Just imagine 2001. Now, their reputation for novelty releases only expanded when they began working with Barry Hansen, better known as Dr. Demento, whose nationally syndicated shows of novelty music helped make him a household name. Well, at least my household. Anyone else? Yes, that's what I thought. He also helped to break numerous acts, most famously, of course, Weird Al Yankovic, an entire CD of covers of Louie Louie, a series of albums dedicated to celebrities and their marginal singing styles. Just think William Shatner, Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds, or a disc of 70s pop hits so reviled that they were guaranteed to kill the mood of any party. That's 70 party classics killers, is what that says. Releases like this typified the Rhino novelty aesthetic throughout its entire run. Another way the label engaged with a popular culture aesthetic was with their logo. A hipster teenage rhino named Rocky, complete with pimples, created by graphic comic artist William Stout, and catalogs that resembled comic books from far more than they did corporate record release books, down to cover art by Scott Shaw and a fake Comics Code seal. Now, the reality of the record industry in the early 80s, however, was that licensing songs from other companies just wasn't common. Rhino struggled to create compilations because the songs would be coming from numerous labels, and the numbers that Rhino would produce, usually around 5,000 copies was a hit for them, wouldn't make it worth the time and money for the companies to deal with licensing requests. At the same time, there was, as Bronson recalls, a stigma in the industry against older releases or catalog, a belief that non-current songs were passé or not profitable. Bigger labels spent their time and effort on breaking new artists and would only issue older recordings to make as much money as possible from those titles with little thought to reintroducing them to audiences. Bronson stated, quote, "So my goal at Rhino was not only to make the hits available again to those who wanted to hear them, but to turn people on to the great music of the past that they may have never heard." Rhino also differed from places like K-Tel. Who remembers K-Tel? Yes, okay. Which spent a lot on TV to sell hundreds of thousands of records, but the tracks would sometimes be re-records or versions of lesser quality, whereas Rhino insisted on always using the original release of a song, whatever the price. Rhino persisted, however, as the industry vanguard for creating collections using licensed materials. Rhino would eventually show much larger and older record companies how profitable their older catalog could be. In 1981, Rhino released a 3-LP box set dedicated to Ritchie Valens, supposedly, and this is highly debatable, the first retrospective box released in the United States. Bronson had seen box sets around this time from Europe for sale on rock pioneers like Gene Vincent and Buddy Holly. The set included rare photos of Valens, including from his high school yearbook, images of the famous plane crash that killed him, Buddy Holly and the Big Bopper. One of the 3 discs included, a live album, was at the time going for $100 on the collector's market, a remarkable sum in 1981. So, a new demand for oldies began driving sales throughout the industry, perhaps most famously seen in the runaway popularity of the soundtrack album to The Big Chill from 1983, predominantly featuring 1960s Motown hits, which reached number 17 on the Billboard 200 album chart, an unprecedented level for what amounted to a 1960s anthology with no music on it whatsoever. It was so popular that they issued a second album with more songs from the film. Now, it's around this time that 2 significant things happened that changed Rhino's path. The company made a distribution deal in 1985 with Capitol Records, in return giving Rhino access to dozens of artists for their compilations, such as this Nat King Cole Best Of. Also at the time, the compact disc, and that's a compact disc as you can see, was making its first major inroads into the industry. Rhino was an early adopter of the new media form, meaning that it was well used to the technology and the idiosyncrasies of its packaging when vinyl began its slow decline in the late 80s. Their first CD release was, not surprisingly, a best of The Turtles. By the early 90s, Rhino had become known as the reissue label, especially in the area of CDs. As they became more successful, the labels they were working for, that is, licensing music from, began to take notice. Rhino had major success with collections of The Village People, Stephen Bishop and the Spencer Davis Group, for instance. Each time, Rhino's releases would sell big, but then they wouldn't be allowed to continue selling it because the labels would want to do it themselves and make the money rather than licensing it out to Rhino. It's also by the end of the 80s that Rhino stopped signing new artists almost entirely and focused solely on reissues. Their one and only #1 hit was the Billy Vera song At This Moment, which exploded due to being featured on Family Ties as Alex and Ellen's theme song. Michael J. Fox and Tracy Pollan, who of course got married and are still married today.
What did you think?
Sorry, I had to give you a second of this one.
I would say at this moment, when I'm faced with the knowledge.
Okay, so huge hit, and they even, this became, so that really put them on the map, but it was their only #1 hit, not their only gold album, but that's a whole other story. And I think, I just saw this last week in Cambridge, I believe there's actually a new biography or autobiography on Billy Vera that's just been released. Fascinating, fascinating career. The same year that the deal with Capitol expired, Rhino signed a new deal to have access to the combined Warner Elektra Atlantic catalog, otherwise known as WEA, which WEA would sell through their much larger distribution network. So Rhino gets access to tons and tons of new artists, and in return, WEA will sell the Rhino product and of course take a piece of the profit. As Bronson observed, people eventually started buying albums because they were on Rhino. They actually had a label identity despite the fact that they didn't have any artists that were theirs. By the label's 16th birthday in 1995, some are referring to Rhino as the industry's premier archival label. Others saw nothing creative or positive about Rhino's approach. Are the Rhino brothers whacked out funsters or serious pop historians? That's from Newsweek, Richard Harold. One critic referred to the Rhino formula as find a niche lifestyle and strip mine it, while Warner Brothers president Mo Austin called them the bottom feeders of the music industry. Ouch. Now, the rest of the industry can hardly have ignored this new interest in older music, along with how Rhino and other companies were providing this music to consumers. With the rise of the superstore in the mid-90s, it meant that more places, Borders, Barnes & Noble, Circuit City, Best Buy, Sam's Club, Costco, among many others, were buying deeper catalog, along with places like Tower Records, may it rest in peace, which had always had deep stock. This meant that there were more places for Rhino to sell CDs, including box sets. In terms of official recognition, the establishing of Grammy Awards for Best Historical Repackage Album, beginning in 1979, now known as Best Historical Album, and Best Recording Package Boxed from '95, confirms that the industry had accepted historical reissues and deluxe box sets, and these were I just want to use, that's a Lester Young, it's actually the 3rd volume in that series. And this is the Ella Fitzgerald songbooks, which I remember very distinctly when that came out. It was amazing. Now, the box set or collection is just really an extension of the record album in its original form. Back when you bought your music as 78, say this copy of Mamie Smith's Crazy Blues, you'd want something to store your records in, especially if you happen to have a whole bunch of great blues sides, right? Where could you possibly store all these highly breakable shellac discs, especially if you don't have a fancy Victrola with a stand? Why, in a booklet or an album. Nowadays, the meaning of an album as a place in which we collect or compile things of the same media, photo album, record album, postcard, stamp, has mostly been lost to history. But in the early 20th century, the album was how you collected your songs into one place. Somewhere along the lines, the record companies began issuing or reissuing collections of records in an album, either constituting an entire work or songs all by one artist, or pieces all on a theme. So a work, an artist, a theme. In essence, the beginnings of the box set. But these packages of songs are a far cry from the mammoth, all-inclusive, everything but the kitchen sink collections you can find nowadays, such as the amazing Paramount sets, this one and the second one, which is a big metal thing, or the 50th anniversary Sgt. Pepper set, which is just about to come out. And they did this promo, which I have to show you a second, just so you can sort of see what's involved.
She's leaving home after living alone for so many years. Life flows on within you and without you. I read the news today, oh boy.
So lots of fun stuff, basically. We're going to see lots of that in a minute. So. Now, by the early 90s, the mainstream press, that is, not just music journalists, had taken notice of the veritable avalanche of box sets now available. Everyone seemed to have a different idea of which set started the trend. Some looked to Eric Clapton's Crossroads set, the Springsteen Live 75-85, or the Byrds, all from around 1990. And of course, there's Dylan's Biograph from 1985. There's also, and I have it here, so I'll pull it out. There's also the Anthology of American Folk Music. So this is the reissue. That's what it originally looked like. It was actually in LP sets, and this was a reissue on CD from 1997. This is an outlier, given that it was, given that it was originally released in 1952. But given its influence, I want to mention it. As far as I know, it's the only box set to which an entirely scholarly volume is dedicated, among other things. Now, what distinguishes these sets from around 1990 is what we see as the beginning of the box set model. A clear sense of a story being told through which songs are chosen and how they're arranged. A broad retrospective look at a clearly defined person, place, or period, or all three. The inclusion of rare, live, or otherwise novel material. Newly written liner notes to bind everything together. And we can't forget that by the end of the 80s, the compact disc had become widely accepted by a music industry notoriously suspicious and reactionary to new technology. One reviewer opined that the rise of box sets could be tied to consumers wanting to replace their vinyl with more concise collections, and that new music was so terrible that everyone was looking backwards to their favorite artists. If only they knew what was coming. Let's see, I'm going to put that down there. Now, given that the history of the box set hasn't yet been written, and that is not a cause I will be taking up, some of the sets I'm mentioning here, more often than not, are those that were significant to me back in the 90s. Now, the first to make an impression on me as a box set was probably the first for several people, and that was the complete Mozart edition in 1991. They used to have a copy of this for sale at the Classical Annex at Tower Records on Sunset in LA, and I'd go in every so often to look at it very longingly. I had no interest in actually listening to all 180 discs, but just the notion of having all of Mozart's known works in one place and available seemed very enticing, especially in the early 90s. I mean, nowadays, of course, the set's much smaller, and of course, you can do it all online. This notion of completism is one of the most enduring and compelling tactics record companies have for selling box sets. You can own something in its entirety in a single purchase, whether that's the works of an artist, a band, or an entire label, and something easily accomplished with, say, the ridiculously successful Robert Johnson set from Columbia, released on LP, CD, and cassette in 1990. Granted, it only has 29 songs plus 12 alternate takes, but it won a Grammy, charted on the Billboard 200 album chart, and was later added to the Library of Congress's National Recording Registry in 2003. So bigger isn't necessarily better. So I want to stop for a minute and talk about the basic trajectory of the box set emblematized by these guys right here. So first, I'm going to stick with Ray Charles. So Ray Charles is one of the artists that Rhino had access to when they made the WIA Atlantic deal, and that was one of the ones they really, really exploited. He was, of course, alive for, I think, when all of these were released, except for this one. So the first one, The Birth of Soul from 1991, is just Atlantic hits, 3 CDs, but really gives us the essence of Ray Charles in the 1950s. Then there is the complete country and western recordings. This is Modern Sounds in Country and Western Music, which was so successful they actually did a sequel to it. So it's 4 discs, extras, plus a booklet. So it's basically 2 albums plus. Then by 1997, we have this 5-disc retrospective of his entire life, including licensing from other tracks. So his early stuff before he came to Atlantic, stuff from after he left Atlantic, and the country and western albums, and then throughout his entire career, including songs he did in the 90s, as well as, I think Shake a Tail Feather is on here from the Blues Brothers. I'm pretty sure it's on here. So really spanning his entire career. And then we have his entire output from Atlantic, which is this set right here, which has this beautiful book. It's in this fake little record player here. That is cardboard, sadly. But if you look inside, I'll pull that out. You've got all the CDs arranged in there very nicely. And I should say that most of these sets belong to the Library and Archives, and I appreciate them letting me take these out for show and tell, although some of them are mine, just because there are only so many box sets you can have. So, and they haven't actually done this with Ray Charles, but I'll use Otis just as an example. We have what we've come to now, which is their original jacket series, where they just cut out all the pretense, and what you have are the entire run, everything that the artist did with minuscule reprint of the jackets. Nothing more, nothing less. It's just the music. So this is the ultimate sort of incompletism, as long as you want just what was put out and not anything extra. That's the same with this set, the Johnny Cash, which is 67 albums, all his Columbia output. It's kind of an incredible collection, to say the least. Now, these different style sets beg the question, why box at all? In an article published in 1993, just as the box set movement was beginning to gain some serious steam, Mark Fenster pointed out that part of the beauty and danger of the box set is that it legitimates an artist's career through a narrative of greatness. That is, any artist worth a box set must, by definition, be great, be historically significant. All the extras that made a box set especially attractive, B-sides, unreleased tracks, alternate versions, rare photos, unique printed content in the liner notes, all these things supposedly expand our knowledge of the artist, bringing the adoring fan ever closer to musical enlightenment. More recently, Andrew Bottomley has written about 3 basic approaches that he sees to reissuing older material. He talks about the quality historical reissue, which would be a single album, the budget repackaged reissue, which would be basically this, and that's remarkably cheap given that it's 12 albums, and the archival reissue, which brings in a lot of the extras. When it comes to the question of why reissue, though, Bottomley and just about everyone else reminds us that reissues allow labels to exploit their back catalogs and in the process canonize their own artists and music. As Will Straw says, quote, it's favoring the exploitation of existing inventories, or better yet, in Fenster's words, they represent the old huckster maneuver of selling again what you've already sold. Now, some labels don't own any of the music, and therefore there are essentially no limits for them, given that everything will have to be licensed and the set will consist of whatever they can get in the end. This includes Mosaic and Bear Family. And for those of you who are familiar with this, Bear Family is probably the paragon of completism. Their box sets for collectors are legendary in just how thorough they are pulling everything together. Rhino was different in that they started out by licensing material, but came to have reissue control over major labels. Although, as Bronson mentions many times, the labels never seemed to give Rhino complete control, opting instead to hold back certain artists from the proverbial cutout bin of history, or reclaiming artists once their profitability had resurged for some reason. Why then would Rhino even bother to create box sets when they didn't even own the music at first and had to license everything? After the Capitol and then Atlantic distribution deals, Rhino's collections focused on music they had access to, but they continued to license music from other labels that would cost them. Why? Bronson told me that, quote, it was coming from a position as knowledgeable and passionate music fans, rather than thinking that our more completist approach would necessarily bring a higher profit. For instance, like this, the Beg, Scream, and Shout set, which is a collection of R&B soul from the 60s, vast majority of it is stuff that Rhino controlled, but there are some key tracks they wanted to have on here, which they had to pay for, because they knew people would want it, but they themselves wanted to make sure it was as representative as possible, and that applies to just about all the sets here. Box sets don't make a lot of money for big companies, though, given that the sets are more expensive than single-disc best-of collections or even double-disc anthologies. So the music wouldn't just be relegated solely to a box set. Once Rhino got access to another artist or label, they would start out with a box set, like this, or like this, knowing that fans would shell out for the more expensive sets. Then they would release perhaps a 2-disc anthology before calling out the very best and or most popular songs for a single-disc very best of or greatest hits collection. As one Rhino producer explained, quote, in some cases, mostly for artist-type projects, we would also discuss multiple releases and a strategy for rolling them out. Usually a box set, then an anthology, then a best of. The upside-down pyramid, which I've illustrated with these 3 Coltrane releases, although there are many artists that receive the same treatment. So this was the heavyweight champion. This was actually released on vinyl as well, which I didn't bring in. And I'm going to talk about this in a second. And then you have this, which is a 2-disc anthology, and then you have a very best of. Remember, Rhino is far from the only label to follow this kind of model for releases. A sales executive at Rhino also said that, generally speaking, we tried to hit every potential fan at every potential price point. Now, while it doesn't relate directly to how the box sets were created, I do want to mention briefly a key part of the Rhino experience, one which also set it apart from its corporate competitors. It was a great place to work. One article about Rhino stated, quote, unlike most companies whose mission statements are exercises in pomposity, Rhino is the record world's answer to Ben & Jerry, trying to incorporate business and social consciousness, end quote. Foose and Bronson treated their employees like family, and were constantly finding new and innovative ways to keep the employees, us, happy and, naturally, productive. The mission statement posted in the lobby read, at Rhino, our mission is to put out great stuff, have some fun, make some money, learn from each other, and make a difference. The founders were very much invested in outreach and giving back to the community, in addition to donating to a wide variety of local and national causes. Usually those would be listed on the back page of the liner notes in almost every release. The company encouraged employees by providing a paid vacation for the days between Christmas and New Year's in return for each employee performing a certain amount of community service. And I'll tell you, everyone did it. And since not everyone who worked at Rhino was well versed in popular music, there were more than 120 employees working there in the late 90s, and not everyone could be a music nut. The powers that be encouraged both company boosterism and musical literacy through a variety of programs. One that I especially loved was the Record of the Month. A different person each month picked out a title they wanted to share with the company. That person would write up a short explanation as to why they wanted to share the title with their coworkers. Every single person in the company, every single one, would receive a copy of that release for free in their mailbox, along with the reason why it was chosen. I, somewhat cheekily, made the case for, no surprise, a box set. And thus everyone received a copy of the 3-CD Sun Records box when it was my turn to choose. And I only remember this because I actually kept the thing I wrote up and ran across it the other day. So there's something to be said for the presentation of box sets. Let's talk about typology for a second, or how to break these up. So there's the good old-fashioned 12 by 12, right? Modeled on the LP, and there's a whole other history we can talk about why box sets look like this, and especially also the long box, here I haven't shown this one yet, one of the great non-Rhino box sets, the James Brown set, because my understanding, and I'm sure someone will correct me, is that the record retailers didn't want to have to pay to redo their bins when CDs were brought in, and so they created those long cardboard boxes. Everyone remember these? Cardboard where the CD was at the top and there was all this wasted space, because they could just put them in and they're all at the right height and people could still flip through them. So yeah, there's that. There's functional, i.e. there's boxes that just do what they're supposed to do, where you just put everything together. There is what you might call representational, like that one. This is The Clash, also not a Rhino set, but still pretty amazing. Another one, wait, let's see. We'll get to that in a second. There's also referential, where you have something in the cover that's referencing the thing we're talking about, such as shag carpet for 70s coffee, actual coffee beans in the 90s, a leather, fake leather bustier for the Gothic box, etc., etc. Let's see. Now, eventually, we go from a vessel for LPs and CDs to something today not anchored by the actual media, as in the Paramount set, which has hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of CDs. And where are they? They're on a little thumb drive. So the size doesn't matter anymore. It's about the presentation. Now, important box sets historically, of course, I've shown you the James Brown and the Robert Johnson. There's all kinds of different approaches. The completist approach, like Bear Family, which I mentioned. There's also sort of the super completist approach, like this. This is actually from the same folks who did the Paramount set. This is Charlie Patton, but it's not just Charlie Patton. It's all the kinds of music that Patton would be listening to and might have known that was sort of surrounding him at the time. We've got, well, let's see. There's artist-based. Otis Redding. We can even have an unusual artist, such as, oh, right here. Nesui Erdogan, brother of Ahmet Erdogan, founder of Atlantic Records. He started the Atlantic Jazz imprint. So this is basically a collection of jazz Atlantic, but it's not, so it's based on a producer, not on a artist that most people would know. We have the complete collection at a label. So we have the Johnny Cash set. We have the Ray Charles set, the John Coltrane. We also have complete works in the Rhino style. Jack Kerouac, Stan Freberg, Allen Ginsberg on the bottom there, Tom Lehrer, and even collections of speeches. They had a whole word imprint that Rhino was very successful with. We have the entire output of an artist. This is 8 discs of the entirety of the Talking Heads. We have the really complete output of an artist, like this Hank Williams set. Now this is a really interesting example because it includes all known recordings, commercials, demos, radio transcriptions, TV and film appearances, sound checks, alternate takes, everything. And because, like Robert Johnson, his life ended very young, his entire output has been mythologized. And so in part because his official, i.e. studio releases were so limited, people want everything else they can get their hands on, which is why a set like this is kind of amazing. Let's see, how about a label overview? Elektra, Sire. This is another early one, Sugar Hill, first major rap label. How about the entire output of a label? Now that can be small. This just came out from Orc Records. Everything they did is on 2 discs. I think it's 2 discs. Or the entire output of Motown in 13 volumes. Anyone here who's listening to this just knows it's overwhelming and it's amazing to have it all in one place. Genre. And I mean, I'm just scratching the surface here. I could only carry so much down here. Gospel. This was an interesting one because commercial recordings of gospel often don't really they kind of miss the point of gospel. So disco, the folk scene. Genre defining, also interesting. Black music. A Century of Women in Music, the Respect box. This actually has a velvet cover. Still wrapped, we won't talk about that. Location, now you can look at that as a couple things. There's location and there's location as event. So Monterey, right? Woodstock. Big Woodstock anniversary coming up pretty soon. I would not be surprised if they try and do something. It's going to be 50 years? Yeah, that's going to be a big one. The Bristol Sessions, Jimmy Rogers, Carter Family, a couple other minor country stars, right? This is the beginning of country music. So this is a set that not only chronicles the beginning of a movement, but it's at that place. So it really is genre defining. You have the era as genre, and that's really defined by the Nuggets series, 60s garage rock, which was so successful, they did lots of them. There's actually 5 of these. There's an LA one, there's a San Francisco one, I think there might be even another. And there were dozens and dozens of albums in this series, and then tons of offshoots as well. And then there's the really funky stuff. I mean, this isn't even the really funky stuff, right? There's this, like the Have a Nice Day set. There was a Harlem Renaissance set, which was great fun to work on. This one is one of the first ones I worked on, which I really love, which is the Beg, Scream, and Shout set, which had, this also goes in the mimetic, where we actually take out, right? So really trying to get at, for people who would have grown up with this, it's made to look like a 45 carrying case. This actually won Rhino's first Grammy for packaging. And just because it's there, for fun, they added this set of trivia cards for every single song on all 6 discs. This was my first job, actually, was fact-checking every one of those questions, which is why I kept this one. And as you can tell, this can go on and on and on. This is, like I said, it's just scratching the surface. OK. And we can think about the levels of completism that come up here. We can have all known studio albums, we could have all known sounds, or all known recordings. It just depends on what you're interested in. So what makes a good box set is a pretty subjective idea, as you can see, although Mosaic, for instance, actually has a list on their website that they call the key elements of a box set, including limited editions, complete definitive collections, sound restoration, and the Mosaic Records booklet. Now, the booklet is indeed a key point, for it's one of the things that can really differentiate a bunch of music thrown together from a crafted, or to use a word some critics despise, curated collection. Forgive me, curators in the room. Bottomley reminds us that in these booklets, quote, notable third parties are brought in to pen liner notes that historicize and authenticate the author and work from what is a seemingly objective position of expertise. Right, that's the way people do this. Extensive liner notes don't just give us history of a group or session personnel. By having an authority write about the Grateful Dead studio albums or Stax's corporate history, the case is implicitly made for the historical significance of whatever's being discussed. After all, the music must be important if it deserves a box set, right? We're getting back to that idea. Circular reasoning at its best. The music's gravity necessitates the box set's treatment, therefore proving its value. But seriously, another way that Rhino set itself apart was the extensive booklets that accompanied the box sets. As often as possible, the compilation producers would ask artists who had been involved with the music itself to write an essay or contribute somehow to the process, as opposed to just asking historians who might offer a more clinical view of the music. Journalists, writers, historians, poets, you never knew who you'd find in a Rhino liner note set. And with the bigger sets, it'd often be an assemblage of essays, like excuse me, the Charles Mingus Complete Atlantic box set, which had notes from producer Joel Dorn, engineer Tom Dowd, Mingus' widow Sue Mingus, and 2 musicologists, along with the original notes for all of the albums by Nat Hentoff and Mingus himself. Now, remember those idiosyncratic collections of songs that put Rhino on the map? They did everything from hits of the 70s, history of surf guitar, doo-wop classics, Master of the Blues, you name it. Well, in a reversal of the start big and then parcel it out approach, several of these successful series were turned into box sets, such as the super hits of the 70s, Have a Nice Day series, which ran to more than 24 volumes. They were condensed and collected into the 7-disc Have a Nice Decade box set. This guy. This was so successful, actually, it led to 2 more sets, an 80s and a 90s set, including that one with the coffee. Now, there's something to be said. There's something in the box set that's not unlike watching a Hollywood film. The final product is so polished and professional that it's very easy to not consider the many hours and hands that went into its creation. It's equally easy to overlook or ignore the long list of names that you're presented with at the end, the real people whose ideas and time led to the thing you've just experienced. While most people would not complain about the invisibility of the production process, I want to pull back the curtain for just a second, for it's during this time that some of the most important and misunderstood steps in the creation of a box set occur. Now, while my main job was in editorial, I took part in the conversations for several anthologies and boxes, some of which came to fruition and some did not. Often the process would begin with an idea, a collection on a particular artist who hadn't yet been given the box set treatment, or perhaps new material had surfaced or become available that would make a competing box set still profitable. Whatever the topic, whether or not the set would make money was, for better or worse, a major consideration. A member of the Rhino A&R team who I worked with extensively told me, quote, the biggest driver was what the salespeople thought something would sell at different levels. And then they would run a profit and loss to determine feasibility. But the idea of whether something was either aesthetically well served in a box or otherwise would have entered into it as well, end quote. But there's also the question of exactly what the box should or could do. Thane Tierney, a sales director at Rhino during my time there, who went on to co-found Universal's internet-only catalog group Hippo Select, they're the ones responsible for the Motown series. He said that, quote, a box set was a nice way to give a medium-sized fan a way to wrap his arms around the catalog without becoming a completist. And he continued, I think that for any box set compiler, the first order of business is to throw a rope around the intended scope and purpose of the box. Is it complete, or complete for a given time period, segment of an artist's career, label affiliation? Is it a career retrospective, touching all the hits and some of the neglected tracks? Is it a collection of rarities, B-sides, live tracks? Are there other considerations? End quote. What about the decisions that get made when actually devising a track list? For the complete works approach, you'd think it was fairly easy, as presumably nothing gets omitted, and yet there are different levels of completion. Many sets include alternate takes, false starts, incomplete recordings, and so on. There we go. So the Coltrane Heavyweight Champions set is a good example, as it includes not only the contents of all 7 of the album's Coltrane Atlantic release with Coltrane, but also includes several previously unreleased alternate and or incomplete takes, which with Coltrane was a particular miracle given the supposed loss of all the Atlantic unreleased material in the 1978 Atlantic warehouse fire. Not to be a ruthless self-promoter, but we had a similar time with Courage, the Atlantic recordings of Rufus Harley, which I produced for Rhino Handmade. We re-released Harley's 4 Atlantic albums, plus 1 unreleased track. Perhaps the extreme of such an approach can be seen in 1970, the Complete Funhouse Sessions, a 7-disc set from 1999 that documented every last sound recorded during the sessions for the second Stooges album, Funhouse. This set originally sold on Rhino's Handmade imprint, an online-only limited release line, and went through all 2,000 copies in a matter of weeks. But when being a completist isn't the goal, we have to start asking questions about what tracks are included and which aren't. These are the kinds of issues that consumers and critics often wonder about, whether they're casual or highly informed fans. Why, for instance, are the Crystals nowhere to be found on the otherwise magnificent girl group sound set? And no Gibbs, Barry, Maurice, Robin, or Andy are to be found on the disco box. What ends up happening is that rather than being a completist, the compiler has to be more of a creativist. That is, coming up with creative and often unexpected choices to fill out a collection when key and canonic artists or songs aren't available for a given set. Rhino often had to go without key songs in anthologies because the songs cannot be licensed. Certain artists were not licensed to other labels, or would only do so for unreasonably high sums of money. Sometimes the other major labels had their own reissue divisions, with their own plans for the music. Sometimes they wouldn't want to dilute the power of the music by having it appear on too many releases. And sometimes the artists themselves wouldn't allow the music to be licensed. In a similar vein, there are collections purporting to be representative that might rely entirely on songs from labels Rhino owned or controlled, creating a skewed perspective that many consumers might not comprehend. For instance, fans knew immediately that the 70s punk rebellion box, No Thanks, contained not a single track by the Sex Pistols, but the casual consumer might not understand what has been left out of the picture. There's also the more complicated question of cross-licensing, in which Rhino would be granted permission to use a song from a company in return for Rhino allowing that company the use of a song from one of their products. So that kind of a thing. These deals were never acknowledged in the packages themselves. I mean, it would say where the song came from, but it wouldn't say that we got this song because we gave them one of ours. Why would you? And yet, once more, it reminds us how much the product we take home is as much a result of proverbial horse trading about the music's historical or creative significance. I'm going to skip that slide, and yeah. Now, it's easy to read a reissue, as Bottomley puts it, as confirming our beliefs in music. It allows us to transform the meaning and values of those old texts in the present. Now, to me, this means that we're shrouding history on something that is entirely newly conceived and created in the context of now. The only thing that's old is the music. Personally, I like this idea of packaging old music like this in a way that plays to modern sensibilities of the music that the companies are trying to sell, like dressing up an old horse. At the same time, we know it's impossible for there to be a correct version of history. So competing anthologies allow for different, even contradictory understandings to be raised about the same stories in music history, which, as Sophia Malson recently wrote, reflects the heterogeneity and multiplicity of music. Now, 2 last points. Speaking of shrouds, not everyone wanted to be included in a Rhino package. Many saw being anthologized as tantamount to having one's career declared dead. If you're in a box, so to speak, the story's over. It's all retrospective from here on. There was one incident in particular I recall with a well-known hard rock group. I'll let you guess who. We were going to do an anthology of their many albums. The original members were all still alive, and the partner of one of the band's most iconic member was resistant to the bands being anthologized by Rhino, because it not only meant the group was old and moribund, but it might close off future possible opportunities, say a reunion tour, other albums, if people mistakenly thought that the group was dead. Given that so much of Rhino's output comprised dead, literally dead artists, it's no surprise people thought of it as a memorial label. And yet all the other reissue imprints face that same problem. As Brian Wright has noted, this box set becomes a mausoleum of sorts, an edifice meant to memorialize something great that has since passed. And finally, there's an interesting side product of the box set that seemed to thrive particularly at Rhino, and that's the sampler. A single CD encapsulation of the box, one that strove to capture the essence of the larger collection. Actually, this one I love. This belongs here to the Library and Archives. The rest of those are mine. Now, these promotional CDs were not sold in stores, but were used to interest potential purchasers or promoters, radio stations, vendors, whatnot. The trick with such a collection is that you couldn't just fill it with all the biggest hits or most recognizable tracks. Why bother buying the box when you've already got all the good stuff? With Rhino, the box sets, especially the theme sets, progressive rock, doo-wop, disco, there was very little filler. Thus, a sampler would truly be a sampling of the contents rather than potentially obviating the need for the larger set. Any sampler would also want to convey what made the set unique and interesting, which for a Rhino set would have meant getting across the quirky sense of humor that drove just about all Rhino products. So, we can see how much the box set business has changed over time. Fenster says that, quote, a culture industry like the music business must continually figure and refigure out how to sell its products at a profit, end quote. There's little doubt that an approach like the current vogue for sets of complete albums, like these two, is directly related to the digital music era. There was no chance of selling all the albums by an artist 20 years ago. Why would you? But now, of course, you can accomplish that digitally in a few seconds. If you're still tied to the idea of a physical product, well, the company's happy to provide you the music in a neat and tidy package. In his wonderful essay, In Memoriam, The Music CD and Its Ends, Will Straw traces the slow but inexorable demise of CD packaging, and along with it, any practical need for the box set. He says, quote, automobile CD players, portable listening devices, and laptop computers all encourage us to transport, store, and play the CD apart from the texts and images intended to circumscribe and illuminate its musical content. There seems to be a largely unspoken expectation with box sets that they are meant to be enjoyed while sitting in one's easy chair, where you can fully immerse yourself in the audio-visual tactile experience. Now, I've long been frustrated when I take a disc or two from a box set in the car with me, like this. I remember this very distinctly happening. So I put this, I put it in my little handy CD carrying case in the car, and what happens? Not only does it seem cruel to separate the discs from their siblings, who are often color-coded, numbered, or otherwise packaged in a manner that makes a missing disc look like a catastrophe has occurred, but I know full well that, assuming the disc even has an individual sleeve or jacket, that sleeve jacket will not have the track list. And I'll wonder what the song is or who's playing the drums while stuck on I-90, knowing the 132-page booklet safely awaits me back at home. So remove the box set from its natural habitat, the den or living room, and suffer the consequences. Straw says, few would have predicted in 1986 that the life of the CD as a cultural form would come to be bound up so strongly with its capacity for mobile listening outside of the home. This is so true for me and so antithetical to the purpose of the box set. Now, what now with almost everything available on iTunes, or better yet, YouTube? Well, each new box set, Straw states, quote, ease the transformation of back catalogs into databases that lend themselves to relatively effortless search and retrieval operations. Now, this last point of his, I think, is the most spot on for me, as it conjures images of anthology compilers sitting around and simply Googling songs on one search string or another until they reach the requisite number of tracks to fill a box. Now, while this may be the practice now, it's only a fairly recent development. Part of the challenge and joy of producing these collections, single disc or multi-disc, is the thrill of the hunt, the search for novel or new sides to share with others. For years, you could only find the accountings of such information in multi-volume books that chronicle recording sessions, record label output, or artist discographies, many of which are in this building right here, but were often shared amongst collectors and coveted, even confidential documents. Sorry. Fenster ultimately sees box sets as, quote, an attempt to control, literally to box in, the continually evolving knowledge of pop music history. Now, while I agree that box sets and record labels play an active part in how popular music history is understood, especially by more casual fans, I wonder how much labels see their role in all of this beyond simply selling and reselling their own stuff. Do they actually care about their musical legacy? Some do, and some don't. In 1980, an editorial appeared in Billboard that read in part, "It seems that our industry has lost sight of the elements that made the music great and the sales healthy." With the bulk of today's records falling into a marginal okay category, it's no wonder that people are taping these records, mind you, this is 1980, so they can tape over them a few months later, after the record has lost the only potency it had. When we once again start making music from the heart instead of for the charts, I'm confident that the music industry will be revitalized and profits will be up. This was written by Rhino co-founder Harold Bronson, long before Rhino Records became the industry leader that, well, it would become. What I hope to have shown that before the demand for box sets largely died away, and before the label was absorbed into the larger WIA machine in the late 2000s, that Rhino played a crucial role in convincing people that they could enjoy the same music in a different, more expensive format, and that their profound love of music led the rest of the industry to embrace reissues, not just as a cash cow, but as a way to encourage a love for one's favorite music. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Daniel. It was fantastic. We have lots of time for questions, if there are any. Okay, we'll start right here. And if you can wait for the microphone, that would be great.
Specifically, what classes do you teach at Case?
I teach classes in the history of popular music. So I teach a class on Tin Pan Alley. I teach history of rock and roll. I teach classes on, I just finished a graduate seminar on Tin Pan Alley and an undergrad survey on the history of Hollywood cartoons. So 20th century pop culture, visual, musical media. That's, yeah. So let's talk after.
Any others?
That was an easy one.
Excuse me.
Brian.
Thank you, Daniel.
Yeah.
Wonderful talk. My question is sort of following up on this digital question, because I very strongly remember these Rhino High Five EPs that they put on in the iTunes era, where basically it's a Rhino reissue where they pick 5 songs, but they were like $250 or something. It was half the price of the competition on these things. And those seem to me to be that cash cow sort of reissue in a different way. But if you look at the albums, they all have giant Rhino like logo on them. So I was wondering if you could speak to sort of that mid-2000s Rhino aesthetic.
Oh yeah, I'm well, I could say a couple things about that. I'm not claiming that they were not trying to make money. And I hope I haven't gotten that point across. They were. I mean, that was why they're there. But if nothing else, I think Rhino was very concerned with putting out music that they thought was good, that people would like, and making money on the process. Now, I also think that once they were absorbed fully by the Warner Music Group, which happened, it actually happened right after, so I left to take my first job as a professor in July of 2001, and 2 months later they moved to Burbank from West LA, and that was where it sort of began. And the culture of the label changed, and I actually spoke with a friend of mine just a couple days ago. He said that the San Francisco Nuggets set was the last Rhino style set to come out, and that thing is, what year is it? That's probably 10 years old, meaning a collection that brings things together with a lot of thought, that's not just one artist, that involves cross-licensing, blah, 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 blah. What took its place? Single artist collections, which are much easier to exploit, and the kind of marketing that you're talking about, where they're really just trying to deal with what they've got and not bother with anything that's not going to make them money in an immediate fashion, basically modeling what the rest of the industry was doing. Now, there were still other projects they were doing. The Stooges set was part of their internet-only line, Rhino Handmade. That's where I did the Rufus Harley set. They did a lot of that for a while, where it was stuff that they thought fans would want, and the way that it was profitable was they didn't advertise it. It was online only. They would be in very small runs, so there was much less overhead to deal with. That is how the entire Hippo Select series, it's basically modeled on Rhino Handmade. It's essentially the same thing from another label. I think the short answer is they were really starting, what was Rhino stopped being Rhino. Bronson and Foos had left, by the way. They'd been bought out, so they actually went on to start another company, or at least Foos did, Shout Factory, which has done a lot of the same thing. They've reissued a lot of popular music, much more in terms of old TV shows. They were responsible for the reissue of the Tammy Show, for instance. They were the ones who made that finally happen. I guess they became more corporate, I'm sorry to say. Does that answer your question? Yeah.
Hi, Dan. Really enjoyed your presentation.
Thank you.
With the recent, revival of the interest in vinyl records, has Rhino embraced that along with, making box sets, including LPs?
Yes. The answer is yes. I didn't bring them in just because there was, again, too much. Rhino recently started distributing Parlophone. Now, not Beatles Parlophone, because of course they're never going to give that one up, but it means the Bowie catalog. And it happened right before, I believe it happened right before Bowie died, like right before. So the massive box sets you've seen of Bowie, if anyone's seen these, that's all coming from Rhino. Now, how much their input is unclear, because it's now basically an imprint that is, it's a label, like an actual, like a logo, but the people who work on that are part of the larger Warner Music Group. And how much input they have into that is unclear to me. I haven't gone that far down the hole yet. But they're definitely doing vinyl. So the Bowie stuff has all been issued on vinyl and on CD. And they're going to keep doing that. I just actually a couple days ago got this beautiful Edith Piaf set. And I meant to actually show this. This goes with my mimetic category. So this is down to the label here. This is meant to look like a 78 album, except it's CDs, right? This is Billie Holiday. I mean, it's beautiful. It's, the Morocco, fake leather, the whole thing. The Piaf set is like this. It's in a record carrying case, 20 CDs, plus some vinyl, plus a booklet, plus 3 laser-cut dioramas of scenes from Piaf's life. Not really sure why those are there. So they have not given it up, but again, it's few and far between. And it's also still this completist idea. We're not just going to do a retrospective of Piaf. We're going to give you everything and really we're going to throw it all at you. So they have absolutely embraced vinyl.
Daniel, I have a question for you. As you know, we had Peter Gralnick here a few weeks ago, and he was here talking about his Sam Phillips bio, which is now the definitive bio of Sam Phillips. One thing that struck me about, among the many things that struck me in that book, was a statement later in the book where Peter talks about how Sam was finally in the 80s, once all these Sun reissues start coming out, was beginning to become accepted as sort of this genius for the first time, at least among the general public. And for me, that's always been something you take for granted. Sam Phillips was a genius and was a pioneer. And I'm wondering if you could speak to or talk about the idea that for people in our generation who were largely buying records and grew up when these beautiful box sets were already being compiled, how much that has affected our perception of the historical importance of certain artists, certain labels, and their place in the canon.
Wow, that's a great question. It's complicated. I do think that the way that people are learning about music now has as much to do with the way it's being presented, i.e. the packaging and the selling of the idea of that artist through the packaging. And it doesn't have to be a big box set. It could be an anthology, as it is the person's actual historical contributions. And of course, that's totally subjective, right? I never heard of Rufus Harley until someone said, hey, you ever heard of Jazz Bagpiper? Like, yeah, you're kidding, right? And then I listened, I thought, wow, this is great. Why is it that no one knows about it? Well, it turns out not that many people are interested in hearing jazz bagpipe. They're lost. But we create the set and we create that narrative for people in a way that you wouldn't have had back when they were originally released, because it wouldn't have been as easy to find. In part, I think it has to do with how, well, you're asking about like in the 80s when he's really coming up. Nowadays, of course, everything's available online, so it's easy. But even in the 80s, when Rhino does the Sunset in the early 90s, late 80s, early 90s, Bear Family starts doing the complete Sunset, and those are basically, they look like, they're like this. I think there's like 7 of them. And again, they're massive. That is what's really happening, I think, with Rhino and Bear Family and Mosaic and some of these other companies that are interested in reissues, is they're trying to not rewrite the story, but they're writing the story. The story of popular music, you know, the history, the canon, if you will, hasn't been created yet. And these labels have a key role in helping us understand who we think should be. I mean, they're telling us who to think is important, just as much as people like Guralnick, you know, Marsh, you know, any music critic of the time is saying, here's who I think is important. The record companies are creating their own story of who they think is important. And then if you come to the rock class that I teach, or that they teach the Rock Hall, or that Brian teaches, there's another story, right? And that's really the fun part of rock history, is reconciling all of these different narratives to try and make sense of what was really going on. And then you ask somebody who lived through it, like, you know, I never heard of these guys. This is what I listened to. So answer is, I think they had a key part, but it's so much more complicated because there's all these different stories happening at the same time.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Hello there. These sets make the most perfect gifts. And I really think a lot of it, that they are sold just because, you know, someone loves this person or genre and they do buy them. But my question is, I just had to buy a car and it did not have a CD player in it, and I was shocked.
Yep.
So I actually had to buy a lower car just so I could have the CD player in it. So who would ever think? So I couldn't get the sunroof because I wanted the CD player. So how do you see what will be happening to box sets of this type?
Well, the Paramount set is the good example here. So I mean, and this is I mean, this is, what is this, Andy? Was this like $400? I think $400, right? Amazing, or $500. Amazing, beautiful book. Actual, like, you know, mock or real, they're the real 78s, but all the way in the bottom. How many songs is this? 500?
800.
800 songs, right? There's 800 songs, and the other one of these, which is in a metal box, has the total output of the label. So this is the future in a way, right? Because you will eventually be able to get everything in this small format. The question is, are you willing to let go of all the extras? No, I'm not either. And is it because I'm living in the past? Maybe. I like to know this stuff, and I like to be able to find it easily. Should I be reading it while I'm driving? No, but I do like to have it around. You know, maybe I can put it in the car and listen to it and go home. I don't know that I have a good solution for it. I do think that the format is eventually going to go away, as you know, it's going to become harder to find and more expensive. I don't know that it would actually disappear entirely, but it definitely doesn't seem to have a good prognosis at this point. And I agree with you. I couldn't find the CD player in my last car at first, and then I realized they hid it because they see it as an old technology. So, Jason.
Daniel, I just wanted to play off the thing you just said about the sort of future where the box set's going, and it's interesting to think about that. I think one of the curious things is that you see a lot of bands actually adopting all the sort of format and philosophy you talked about today in individual albums. I know for myself, bands like Nine Inch Nails or Coheed and Cambria, you can buy their new album from the band directly and get a bonus CD, a DVD that they shoot of in-studio film, a booklet. That won't be sold in the digital formats or in record stores. You have to order it from them. We got one from Coheed and Cambria that had a sleeve. I mean, it basically looked like a box set,
right?
But it's one album. Do you think that will continue? Do you think that's the way that they'll entice audiences to buy individual records, but using that same sort of philosophy?
I do. I think it will continue, but I think it's targeted at the fan. I think they're targeted at it's not the casual listener. The casual listener doesn't need that. The casual listener will do it as a download, or might buy it if they can find a record store somewhere, or buy it on Amazon. But the person who knows the group, they're going to know enough to go to the None Such site, for instance. I was thinking the Magnetic Fields just put out another box set, and all these extras that came with it if you pre-ordered it. So yeah, I think it's going to keep happening, but I think it's still this separation of casual listener versus the intense fan. And then, of course, there's the completist who probably isn't listening to new music anyway, but yeah, that's another story. I'll probably get in trouble for that one.
Thank you. That was very insightful. When you were speaking, I was thinking about certain, like, you know, just my own personal history. What about an artist like Bob Marley, who's someone who has dozens of box sets and anthologies, and this one's remastered and this one has unreleased tracks, but then you know, sort of compare them and it's the same thing and they sound the same. Yep. And the money's not going to the estate of, you know, Marley's children. Right. So could you speak a little bit on, like, maybe authenticity of the box? In brief,
that's a
not
great
too
one.
long.
Yeah, we'll be here all night if I talk about authenticity. Yeah, that's a tough one. You know, Ray Charles is involved with these, for instance, right? He had a certain amount of oversight, although some artists don't care. I mean, they'll have either the record companies have already contracts that say the record companies can do what they want. Others, I mean, notoriously this one, which Bronson talks about in the autobiography as being that one they had actually contracted to do this, and Rhino had, and they couldn't work it out because Phil Spector being Phil Spector. Not the easiest person to work with, apparently. And so Avco did it, and it became kind of a fiasco. And he writes about, you know, they had thousands of copies remaindered because they just didn't promote it properly. And I think he says he even bought like a dozen copies at $5 or $10 a piece to give to friends, you know, way on. So, you know, the artist being involved, it's almost a utopian idea, right? Where, especially with someone who's died, we want there to be that kind of oversight. We want there to be the thought, and I hate to say it, but I think it really comes down to the company. Some companies seem to be really interested. They don't have a problem with exploiting their catalog, right? It's what it's there for. We own it. We can do what we want with it. Did Rhino do that? Absolutely. That's what it's there for. But they also, I think, would want to make the pitch that they're appealing to different audiences. So like that pyramid I showed where you have the real fans will buy the Coltrane, the big Coltrane set. Casual fans are going to buy the 2-disc anthology to get a little bit of everything, although that set's really problematic because they couldn't license Kind of Blue because Columbia's not going to give them Kind of Blue. So one of the most important recordings ever made is not on there. Super casual, just learning, you get the 1 disc. It's all the same music? Yes. Are they making money on it 3 times? Absolutely. Are they appealing to different audiences though? That's going to be your argument. Now with Marley, I mean, Marley's, it's a really complicated thing because of family history and heirs, but I feel like it's the same thing. Or I think there's some of the same issues involved. Kind of answer the question, but maybe not hitting all the points. John, did you have
a? It was great, Daniel. But and you were saying with Rhino, you guys, I know there were different audiences with different price points, but effectively it sounds like you were looking to attract the casual fan, trying to sell something to make a profit. What do you think about groups like Numero Group out of Chicago, I think, where they're putting out really, really, really niche products, still very completist in their approach? What do you think of their work?
Well, I think that, well, I mean, I could compare them to these guys. I mean, Revenant is doing exactly the same kind of thing. I mean, this is as limited edition as it gets. I think, again, to me, they ultimately have to make money, right? They can't do it out of love. I mean, that might be the thing that's driving it. And I certainly brought plenty of pitches to the producers at Rhino, the A&R guys. Oh, could we do this? Yeah, is it going to make money? All right, I go back to the drawing board. That would always be the thing. Sorry? Ugh. I'll have to think about that. I think I tried to block them out. We actually tried, being this was my area, I tried to pitch a collection of music from cartoons, because that was what my first few books were on. And we actually got pretty far in the process. We had a track list. We started talking about licensing, but it was such a hard sell, and no one was convinced that it was actually a good idea. It was more of a, let's do this because, not let's do this because. So it never went anywhere. I should mention, by the way, there was, if you want the oddball set, I mean really oddball, this is one that I end up co-producing. It's not a music set, it's actually survivor testimony from Holocaust survivors. This was brought to the founders. I can't remember who it was brought to. They were really moved by this, the person who brought it, who was a documentary filmmaker. And so it's 4 CDs of survivor testimony, some that had been newly recorded, some from the Shoah Foundation. But this was an entirely different kind of project, because the booklet, it was a real history of the Holocaust that we had to do, and it was way more work than any other project I ever did, which is why I ended up getting a credit on it. But again, that was the thing that made Rhino different, is they would actually take something like this on and run with it, rather than saying, yeah, that's not going to make us money. That's not good. They felt passionate about it, and they did it. So, one more? Good.
It's a simple question. Why weren't the Sex Pistols on the No Thanks box set?
Licensing. I think I actually read somewhere that it was, I think they were mad at Rhino for something. But I'd have to go, yeah, I mean, that's not really slicing it too thinly. I mean, the Sex Pistols being mad at people that's not really that uncommon an excuse. I'm sure that Rock Hall's never had that problem either. But that has come up. It was really fun, though, I have to say, in talking with the people who would do the licensing, hearing the stories about, who they can get, or it's like, well, we can get that, but it's going to be work. Can we maybe get a less famous track from that person? And that's what ends up happening in a lot of these sets. It's like, okay, yeah, there's this track from Elvis, but it's not on one of his #1 hits, of which there are so many. Couldn't we just get one? Like, no, it's not going to happen. So it's very common, and that's where the real criticism of what they were doing would happen. Like, couldn't they get this in? And there's actually, this came up with the Black History one. This is the slide I skipped, where in the book, the very second page, there's actually a disclaimer, a disclaimer basically saying we couldn't get certain artists. We tried, we wanted them here, but realities of the business mean we're not going to have no 80s Michael Jackson, no Public Enemy, no Stevie Wonder. That's kind of important to have in a collection like this. So critics were not really nice to it. And another label had done a Black History project just a few months earlier, and I think people were comparing them, and they did have Stevie Wonder. So there was like why did they even bother if that other one was? Well, this had been in production for already a year, so they weren't going to pull the plug on it.
Was that the Back in Black box?
Yep. That's the one.
Back on the Paramount, can you address the quality of the recordings on the thumb drive? Are they low-end MP3s or WAV files? Or?
I don't know. Do you know what? I actually don't know what the quality of them is. I've not had it. I don't own it, sadly. I haven't had a chance to go through it.
I think it's MP3s.
Yeah, I do think it's MP3s. So.
I don't know.
Yeah, I mean I believe the answer is they are. I think it's supposed to compare to CD quality in part because they weren't going to try and cheap out when they were doing a project like this. It's all show, and then the music isn't that good, especially from this period where you already have major issues with with sound quality. But you know what? I honestly don't know. So, but that is a good point with a lot of these sets. What kind of time are they going to put into remastering, or are they just putting out, as Sully mentioned earlier, they're just going to put the same sound over and over again? Why buy it if it just sounds the same?
What's the limitation on that? What's the limitation on that Paramount set?
Limitation meaning?
How many did they issue?
Oh,
Is it tight? Is it 1,000?
I think it might be something like 1,000.
Yeah, I think it's like 1,000 or 2,000 maybe. But it's at 500 a piece. They're not going to fly off the shelves. Right. They are amazing though, and you should all come and look at it, sometime. This and the other one, or just look online. You can see everything that's there. I mean, beautiful amount of work, beautiful production, but come on.
and then the value down the line for reselling it or collectability. Does it get soft? Does it hold its own?
Question is, is this going to hold value? Box sets. That's a really good question because some box sets really hold value. Some are really expensive. This one, for instance, the Stooges set. They have reissued this since, but the original one, because it was a limited issue, I know people who were selling this for 2, 3, 4 times what it had cost, and it was only about $100 when they sold it. People were selling. I saw it on eBay for $400 or $500. So some of these sets, especially and Mosaic, limited. So if you want this and it's gone, you're going to pay for it. This is made to have that kind of value purely from the production standpoint, if nothing else. And then it's a limited set in its own right. So I think the answer would be yes, it will probably hold its value. But it's only been out for a couple years, so time's going to tell with that.
Daniel, tell us, in your opinion, what was the greatest box set
No.
ever compiled?
Come on, you're killing me.
Or if it's easier or harder, your top 5 maybe.
Ooh, top 5 lists. We always love top 5 lists. Well, these, which I didn't mention, which I brought and did not throw out, the doo-wop sets, early Rhino sets, they're great. One that I should have brought but don't have anymore, the Cowabunga surf box that Rhino did early on, also a really great set. Not a Rhino set, but really one of the great box sets of all time. Oh, I have a picture. My first box set, not the greatest, but I have to show it anyway. Bought that early on. Yeah, it's hard because there are a lot of good sets. Most of these I haven't looked at in a long time, but some of them, the Ray Charles, the James Brown is in constant use at my house. I just had it playing 2 days ago. Oh, and the Coltrane, absolutely. So, but these are just, unfortunately, these are all the things that I like, but they're great because I like them.
Okay, from the best to the worst. What are some of the songs that are ultimate party killers?
Oof. Billy, Don't Be a Hero. Oh, gosh. Oh, Precious and Few. Yeah, thank you. You just grimaced. I think I just made my case right there. I can't remember them all, although I do remember somebody who was on it was not happy to have been included. Oh, I think Alone Again Naturally might be on there too. Yeah, right. I'm pretty sure they got flack from one of the artists who was alive, obviously. How dare you include me on this? My music is timeless, blah, blah, blah. Like, dude, you should be happy it's out there again. So, yeah. Muskrat, okay, Muskrat Love. John's reading this, yes? Oh, yeah, go. Okay, thank you, John.
By the way, it's on sale for like $40 on Amazon. So, tie a yellow ribbon around the old oak tree.
Oh, good.
The Night Chicago Died. Billy, Don't Be a Hero. You're Having My Baby, Paul Anka. Playground in My Heart, Clint Holmes. Feelings, Morris Albert.
Naturally.
Sometimes When We Touch, Dan Hill. The Candyman, Sammy Davis Jr. Afternoon Delight, Starland Vocal Band.
Oh, come on now.
Torn Between Two Lovers, Mary McGregor. Escape, the Pina Colada song, Rupert Holmes. And Muskrat Love, Captain Anthony.
And remember, these are all songs that Rhino had easy access to that they probably wouldn't have had to get clearance. They wouldn't have had to ask the artists for permission to put them on a collection like this. So.
There's only one left in stock, so order soon.
Yeah. I'm not sure we can say anything after that.
I don't know either. Do we have one more question? Anybody? Okay.
I would add Shannon too.
Oh God, yes. Next for volume 2.
Well, thank you all again for coming, and we want to thank the American Musicological Society and Bob Judd at the AMS for hosting this great series with us. Please stay tuned for more of these. We'll probably do one later this year. Thank you again, Daniel. This was fantastic. Please join me in thanking Daniel.
Thank you.